After being long fed with hopes of a speedy visit from Mr. and Mrs. Suckling, the Highbury world were obliged to endure the mortification of hearing that they could not possibly come till the autumn. I'm Harriet.
And I'm Ellen, and this is Reading Jane Austen.
This week, we're looking at chapters 42 to 45 of Emma. So, your 100-word summary?
Well, it's a bit more than a 100-word summary this time. Plans for a joint visit to Box Hill are delayed. Mr. Knightley invites Mrs. Elton to a strawberry party at Donwell, where Mrs. Elton pressures Jane Fairfax to accept a governess position. Emma persuades Frank Churchill to stay for the Box Hill party. Frank flirts with Emma, provoking an overexcited Emma to make a joke, which upsets Miss Bates. Frank brings up the subject of short engagements, and Jane intervenes in the discussion. Mr. Knightley rebukes Emma for her rudeness to Miss Bates. Emma then calls on the Bateses, and Jane retreats to her room. Miss Bates reveals that Jane has accepted the governess position and that Frank Churchill has gone home. News of Mrs. Churchill's death arrives, and Jane continues to reject Emma's advances.
Okay, well, here's mine. Mr. Knightley invites everyone to Donwell to pick strawberries. Jane leaves early and Frank arrives late. The next day, they go to Box Hill, where Emma makes a mean comment to Miss Bates. Mr. Knightley criticises her and she feels terrible. The next day, Emma calls on Miss Bates and learns that Jane has accepted a governess position Mrs. Elton was pushing on her. Mr. Knightley, who's about to go to London, is obviously pleased that Emma is trying to make recompense. Then news comes that Mrs. Churchill has died. Jane is clearly unwell but rejects Emma's attempts to help.
Right.
Did you have any general comments about these 4 chapters?
Yes, I did. What sort of struck me was how very, very strongly these 4 chapters incorporate the double story. If you want to put it together, I think the story goes more or less that Mrs. Elton is pressuring Jane to take the governess job. Jane tries to get away from Mrs. Elton. She meets Frank Churchill. Frank tries to get her to go for a walk with him, and she goes away, and he's very cross with her then. So the next day at Box Hill, he flirts with Emma, and then he brings up the problems about people who get married after too short an engagement, and Jane then, she hasn't been saying a word, but she buys in on that one.
Yeah.
And then she goes home very upset with Frank because of the way he's been flirting with Emma. And then they hear...
And then in the evening, she hears that Frank's gone back to Richmond, and it's right after that she says yes to Mrs. Elton. Yeah.
And then she is feeling terribly bitter about Emma. And this is just at the point when Emma is trying to be nice to the Bateses.
Yeah.
And she keeps on escaping from Emma. And we've got all that story. And the second thing about it is you mentioned that Miss Bates's long rambling accounts
tells you everything. And yes, I noticed that in this one too. It's through Miss Bates' inconsequential rambling that you get the fact that Jane accepted the position immediately after learning that Frank has gone back to Richmond.
It's really beautifully done. But I also wonder, does Jane Austen expect that her clever readers will realise after the first double story that you've got to be on the lookout for another one?
It's hard to know. I mean, listening to Pride and Prejudice, where one of them is reading it for the first time, she had a sense there was something going on. And I think she did get it before it actually came out in the book. But she went off on several false starts and she couldn't work it out, but she knew there was something between Jane and Frank. She just wasn't sure what it was. There was actually one thing that struck me in these 4 chapters. It seemed like we were getting more of a picture of Knightley through Emma's eyes. Not just this strong picture of how important it is to her that he thinks well of her, which we've had before but is really emphasised here, but also just the perception of him through her is something we get in these chapters that I'm not sure we got so much earlier.
Right.
So Chapter 42, which is the longest of the chapters we're looking at today, it's the strawberry picking at Donwell, but also with the lead in about the cancellation of Box Hill. And you get so much Mrs. Elton comedy in these chapters.
Yes.
Her wanting to organise and him just not letting her. It's really funny.
Yes. What we've also got, one of the things I was looking at, was we've got Mr. Knightley doing that classic aristocratic thing of being able to put someone down without losing your temper.
Without doing anything that could be considered as rude.
Yes. I suppose what it made me then think about was this picture of the aristocrat who can do this sort of thing through the 19th century. That's the way people tend to display their aristocrats as aristocrats. Okay. They can do this.
But of course, Mr. Knightley isn't an aristocrat. He's solidly upper-end gentry.
Well, that's what I mean. This is what a quality gentleman can do. A second point on that, though, look, I rather liked Mrs. Elton in that scene. I liked the way she had this lovely picture of her and Jane arriving on donkeys, carrying little baskets.
It did make me think of the whole Marie Antoinette trying to be pastoral with cows and things.
It didn't make me think of that. I just thought that was Mrs. Elton being... It's one of these ones of sort of coming round to Mrs. Elton on and off because she's enjoying herself so much. And Mr. Knightley's putting up with her. I don't think he despises her as much as Emma does.
I think he doesn't let himself get made angry by her the way Emma does.
Yes.
He's not going to let her encroach into his domain.
Yes. Yeah.
But he does that impeccably politely. I think he just accepts that she is what she is and he just has to maintain the boundaries.
Well, in the sense that, again, his big job is to keep Highbury in balance, to stop things falling apart. So Mrs. Elton is there. We've got to accept her. We live with her.
Yeah. And the other thing he does is he wants to make sure that he can set the whole thing up so that Mr. Woodhouse can come.
Yes. I wonder why.
Well, I think just because it's a nice thing to do.
It's nice for Mr. Woodhouse, but it's also putting a bit of a burden on Mrs. Weston.
But then, of course, she doesn't have to spend the whole time with Mr. Woodhouse because Emma relieves her at a certain point.
That's right, yes.
And the other thing is, as well as inviting Mr. Woodhouse and therefore having the food inside, he's then made sure that all of his books of engravings, drawers of medals, cameos, corals, shells, all this stuff is there for Mr. Woodhouse to look at. It's like entertaining a child.
Yes.
The other thing that struck me is Mr. Woodhouse says he hasn't been to Donwell in 2 years. And Emma also hasn't been in a long time, so possibly she hasn't been since the last time Mr. Woodhouse went. It's only like a mile away, maybe a mile and a half from Hartfield. And Mr. Knightley walks there himself practically every day. Again, it's just a reminder of how confined Emma's life is.
Yes.
That she walks to the village, but she doesn't do that extra half mile to Donwell. She hasn't done it in 2 years.
Which also sort of implies that Mr. Knightley is not doing much entertaining. Because you would think that if he had a dinner party...
Yeah, if he had a dinner party, we know from the Coles dinner party, Mr. Woodhouse wouldn't go, but Emma would most certainly be invited. So yes, I guess what it does say is he just doesn't entertain much.
Which is surprising.
Maybe it's the whole bachelor establishment thing.
Yes.
And then we've got these descriptions of Donwell and what a wonderful place it is. And it kind of reminded me of Pemberley, just in the sense of this beautifully maintained estate being a reflection of the quality of the master.
On the other hand, Pemberley was very much up to the minute. Pemberley had these wonderful views from each window.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about Mr. Rushworth, he had this wonderful avenue. What you've got at Donwell is this little sort of fake avenue, this lime avenue that leads nowhere. And somehow Jane Austen is approving of that.
Well, apparently, according to my Cambridge edition notes, Godmersham, her brother Edward's estate, had an avenue of limes.
But did it lead anywhere?
I don't know. It didn't say. And, of course, the descriptions of Donwell do have the generally regarded as a classic mistake by Jane Austen, that the apple trees are in bloom.
Oh, yes.
Anywhere you read about it, it always comments that, according to family legend, the mistake was noticed by Austen's brother Edward, who joked Jane, I wish you would tell me where you got those apple trees of yours that come to bloom in July.
Yes.
John Sutherland, in Is Heathcliff a Murderer? He talks about it and he tries to come up with a rationale as to how it's not a mistake. And then in Who Betrays Elizabeth Bennet, he revisits it, but he's still convinced it's not a mistake. I think you just have to accept, yes, she was a brilliant writer. Yes, everything was done deliberately, but maybe she could still make a mistake.
Yes.
And this is where Mrs. Elton starts pushing this post on Jane.
But again, she is able to say no.
Yes.
But you get the feeling it's really getting to her this time.
Yeah, I think, when you know what's been going on, you have to start to think the whole secret engagement is really, really starting to prey on her by now. I really love the bit when she's leaving. She says she's going to walk home. Emma's worried about her being fatigued. And she says to Emma, Miss Woodhouse, we all know at times what it is to be wearied in spirits. Mine, I confess, are exhausted. The greatest kindness you can show me will be to let me have my own way and only say that I am gone when it is necessary. And you just feel so sorry for Jane, what she's going through, and she can't talk to anyone. And
then on top of that, Frank Churchill encounters her.
Well, we assume from what he says that he meets her just as she's left.
Well, I think we're told this. Where he says, I met one of the party.
And he's in a filthy mood when he turns up.
Well, he's in a filthy mood by the time he reaches Emma.
Well, I would imagine he was probably feeling harassed anyway. Yes. And then he met Jane, and Jane rebuffed him.
Yes.
But, he's really being terrible company when he arrives.
Yes.
Jane Austen just captures it so well in the dialogue when he says, as soon as I am cooler, I shall go back again. I could very ill be spared, but such a point have been made of my coming. You will all be going soon, I suppose, the whole party breaking up. I met one as I came. Madness in such weather, absolute madness. That's the bit where you can work out at the time, but subsequently realise for sure that he met Jane. But again, it's just slid into the conversation.
Yes.
The whole Frank and Jane story, that classic detective story thing of putting all the clues there, but in such a way that you don't notice them.
Yes.
Because you're thinking of something else when they're presented. Yes. So here you're thinking about Frank Churchill being in a bad mood.
Yes.
And so you could almost miss the fact that he met Jane just before he arrived.
Yes.
I suppose the other thing that I kind of mentioned earlier, again, you get this picture of the neediness of Mr. Woodhouse and Emma's willingness to give to him. So Mrs. Weston has sat with him all morning, and then Emma, to give Mrs. Weston time to go and walk with her husband, Emma then sits with him and he just sort of is explaining to her all of these things Mr. Knightley put out. It's like dealing with a 6-year-old.
And that's what she's prepared to do. Except, of course, it's a 6-year-old who's going to be 6 for the next 20 or 30 years. Yes. Now, well, with the next chapter, the Box Hill chapter, I have to say I've never really enjoyed this chapter. I've tended to flip through it every time I've been doing a rereading. I really don't enjoy that chapter.
Nor do I. But I think that is the point, not just the peak of Emma being mean to Miss Bates, but the fact that no one's enjoying themselves.
And right from the start, of course, you've got both Jane and Frank arriving in a terribly miserable state.
Yeah.
Both of them furious with the other one and just wondering, will this work, will it not work? And at the beginning, I think, when they're all walking around in sort of little groups, and until they come together, Frank hardly says anything to Emma and Harriet.
Yeah.
But once they come together...
Frank is just horrible in this chapter, and Emma doesn't behave well.
She's forced into it by Frank.
I mean, Frank keeps saying, I am instructed by Miss Woodhouse. No, he's not. She hasn't said anything. He's doing this himself.
And he's doing it at Jane.
Yeah.
He's not doing it at Emma.
He's trying to say to Jane, look, I'm admiring Emma. Watch me admiring Emma.
Yes.
Frank has set up this, saying all this stuff and encouraging Emma to join with him. And I really blame him as much as her for what she says to Miss Bates.
Oh, he's sort of getting her having to join in that kind of silly talk.
Yeah, which he's not particularly enjoying or doing well, and she's not particularly enjoying or doing well, but they're just kind of in this cycle. And then when it's happened, when she said to Miss Bates Mr. Weston, I don't know whether he's just completely misread the room or if he's trying to recover from it by changing the topic, but
he goes straight into making up his silly riddle about
Emma being perfection when Emma has just said that horrible thing.
Yes.
It falls flat. Then the Eltons go away, and that's when Frank has he and Jane are basically having this public fight that nobody knows because nobody knows the backstory, where he says how many a man has committed himself on a short acquaintance and rooted all the rest of his life. And nobody except Jane knows that this is directed straight at her, and it's just horrible.
But after he says that, Jane then comes in with a response.
She must be thinking, is he saying he doesn't love me anymore?
Not so much he doesn't love me, but is he saying it was a mistake?
Yeah. Well, I think that bit about it's only when you see them in their own homes, she must be thinking he must be saying that he doesn't like me anymore now that he's seen me in this context.
Yes.
And then what she says is that a hasty and imprudent attachment may arise, but there is generally time to recover from it afterwards. So he could take that as her saying to him, I hear what you've said, and yes, I'm willing to break it off. Maybe that's what they each think the other is saying. Yeah, I just think what he says is horrible. What she says is a measured response of showing how unhappy she is.
Yes.
This whole chapter is just full of people behaving badly.
Yes, and it's not enjoyable.
No, but I think it's not meant to be enjoyable.
But Jane Austen can make all sorts of awful things enjoyable, a pleasure to read. And that one is somehow not a pleasure to read.
Yeah. Everyone, including the reader, is having a bad time at Box Hill.
Yes.
Now, just before we get to the end of the chapter, the other things I wanted to say about this stage of it is this passing reference by Miss Bates when she thinks she's seen Mrs. Elton, and then she says, no, that's somebody else. That's one of the ladies in the Irish car party, not at all like her. And it suddenly makes you realise, which I think you don't up until then, that whereas at Donwell it was just them, here it's not a private party. This is a public spot that people come to. And the thing about Austen actually did a really good podcast about this bit, what an Irish car is and what an Irish car party is. I listened to it on the way up. It's a great episode, and I'll put a link to it because I really enjoyed it. And they said this as well, but I'd been thinking it even before I listened to it, every movie adaptation of Emma, it's just them on Box Hill. There's nobody else. Whereas, in fact, it would be like when I went to Box Hill last year, and I wasn't the only person there. Box Hill was also a way bigger place than I'd ever imagined from reading the book.
Yes.
You know, lots of people go there. And so you suddenly realise it isn't just them. It isn't a private party. There are all these other people around. And then the chapter finishes with Knightley ticking off Emma for it and Emma being really upset.
Well, Emma wasn't happy the minute she'd said it, I imagine. She thought this is going too far.
Yeah.
And then he tells her, I love the little bit in that where he mentions how when she was a little girl she used to think it was such a privilege.
Yeah.
I thought that was particularly...
Yeah. I did wonder a little bit about the fact that Mr. Knightley says maybe if she were your equal, it would have been okay. And I kind of think, well, no, it wouldn't be okay under any circumstances. It's rude.
Yes.
So the chapter finishes basically with Emma in tears as she's going back in the carriage. The start of the next chapter talks about how it's being even more abhorred in recollection. You know, that thing that you just go over and over and over in your head that you said something terrible and you can't forget it.
Yes.
But then we still have the fact that she pushed it down and she played backgammon with her father all evening.
Yes. After being rude to Miss Bates, Emma thought she needed to call to apologise.
Yeah. Of course, that's one thing. Emma calls. She doesn't actually apologise. It's kind of unstated because Miss Bates is so nice and thinks so well of her that Emma almost doesn't. She's apologising in actions and she's planning to do more good actions in the future, and that feeds into the next chapter with Jane. But she never actually...
It's the same way. It's making these statements in terms of calling. You can say to somebody, I don't want to stay friends with you. I want it to be very formal. I'll only stay a quarter of an hour.
Yeah.
I'm wanting to be friends with you. I'll stay half an hour.
Although she does leave when it's becoming a bit too uncomfortable for her.
No, but she's been there over half an hour. And this is the scene where we get Miss Bates dropping in all the bits of information you need.
Yes, the classic detective story thing of giving you the clues in a way you don't recognise them as clues, where she says, we were at the Eltons and that was when Jane decided and Mr. Elton was called away. Then it came out about the Shays having been sent to Randall's to take Mr. Frank Churchill to Richmond. It was after tea that Jane spoke to Mrs. Elton. You get that precise sequence of events that the thing that triggers Jane to accept the governess position is the news that Frank Churchill has gone away. And she must just think it's over.
Well, that surely he would have made an excuse to come and visit them.
Which he has done every other time before he left.
Yes.
He's probably just still in a really bad mood and just wants to get out, but I would assume Jane takes it as being further evidence of what he said at Box Hill that she thinks he wants out of the engagement. So then chapter 45, the last one we're talking about today, that essentially has three big things in it. First of all, you've got Mr. Knightley learning that Emma has been to call on the Bates and he knows why she's done it and she knows that he knows why she's done it and they're friends again and she's happy. The next thing that happens is the news that Mrs. Churchill has died.
Yes.
And the fact that everybody is shocked and saddened, but also it's good gossip or also it's an excuse to put mourning on your dresses.
Yes.
And the fact that all of these people who'd been saying all of these years she's not really sick
Yes.
were wrong, which is kind of sad. I think the narrator still doesn't really have any sympathy with Mrs. Churchill.
I think the point is here that the narrator is just making general observations about the way the world goes.
Yeah.
And being a bit comic about that.
Yeah, with no actual compassion for the person of Mrs. Churchill. And I was going to say the real person, but of course she's not a real person. She's a made-up person.
But on the other hand, it's one of those things of, is it quite nice to be making these jokes about somebody dying? Is it really appropriate for Jane Austen to be being funny about people dying?
She was in her letters sometimes too.
Oh, yes. Well, she does, yes.
Mm. And then the third thing that happens in this chapter is we get the news that Jane is really sick. And Emma is trying to help and just being rebuffed at every stage.
Yeah.
And I kind of wonder, how is Emma interpreting this? Is she interpreting it as very personal from Jane against her?
I get the impression almost that she's interpreting it as the Bates family backing off because of what she did.
Yeah.
But in her guilt feelings, I mean, her guilt is to be as nice as possible to Jane, partly because she's sorry for Jane having to go off as a governess, but also as an apology to Miss Bates.
Yeah.
And the fact that Jane is backing off makes her feel that the Bateses have taken it very seriously.
I don't think she would feel the Bateses. I think it would just be Jane. I'm not sure whether she's at this point thinking it's personal or just thinking these other people are being pushy, I'm not going to be pushy. But then when Jane keeps on rebuffing her, then she does start to take it personally.
Yes.
Particularly with the arrowroot.
Yes. Jane is being almost a bit ridiculous in refusing the arrowroot. She could refuse to go about with Emma.
Yeah.
But not to sort of refuse to eat any food out of the Woodhouse household.
And then it finishes by saying it mortified her that she was given so little credit for proper feeling or esteemed so little worthy as a friend. But she had the consolation of knowing that her intentions were good and being able to say to herself that could Mr. Knightley have been privy to all her attempts of assisting Jane Fairfax, could he even have seen into her heart, he would not on this occasion have found anything to reprove. So you have almost got her using Mr. Knightley as her measuring stick for her behaviour.
Or her unconscious feeling that she's got to have Mr. Knightley on side. I must be liked by Mr. Knightley.
I think it's a whole bunch of things coming there. So that was all I had to say about those chapters.
Yes, same with me, yes.
So my favourite sentence for these chapters, the one that really makes me laugh every time, is right near the start of the chapters when Mr. Weston has been telling Emma that he's invited Mrs. Elton to go to Box Hill with them and a big party is always so much better than a small party.
Yes.
And it says, Emma denied none of it aloud and agreed to none of it in private. I just love that sentence.
Yes. Oh, well, the one I did, this just comes up at the beginning where Mr. Knightley is sort of telling Mrs. Elton to back off, where she's trying to take over the party at Donwell. And then his lovely put down. No, he calmly replied, There is but one married woman in the world whom I can allow to invite what guests she pleases to Donwell, and that one is..." And Mrs. Elton says, "Oh, Mrs. Weston, I suppose." And he says, "No, Mrs. Knightley. Until she is in being, I will manage such matters myself." I mean, it's so clever and funny. It's just showing him being really very witty.
Yeah. The character we're talking about today is Emma. And of course, we have actually been talking about Emma every episode so far. So this is probably more going to be a summing up than anything new. But one thing is, I have really changed my opinion of her as we've been doing this close reading, because I have never liked her. And while there are times I'm still not all that keen on her, I actually have a lot more time for her than I did previously. One thing I will say is, anytime I've thought back on the book, I have felt that the unforgivable thing Emma does is what she says to Miss Bates at Box Hill. But I have actually totally changed my mind on that. I still think it's horrible, but I don't think it's unforgivable. And as I think I said earlier, I put a lot of blame on Frank Churchill for what happened. If anything she does is unforgivable, it's convincing Harriet to refuse Mr. Martin's proposal. What she says to Miss Bates is unplanned, unpremeditated, and provoked by Frank Churchill, whereas convincing Harriet to refuse Mr. Martin is premeditated and manipulative, and she knows what she's doing, and definitely not nice.
I suppose the way I'm thinking now is I'm just thinking about Emma in general. There are sort of individual things that can be seen as what she did right or what she did wrong, but the general picture we've got, and the one, I suppose, that came out of this close reading, the first thing is just how terribly good she is to her father. I mean, that is just so marvellous.
Yeah, and it constrains her life so much, but everything she does, she always, the first thing is her father. Even in the chapters we did today, where Mrs. Weston sat with Mr. Woodhouse all morning, but Emma just automatically sent Mrs. Weston off to spend some time with her husband, and she sat with her father. And it's fairly clear it wasn't a particularly enjoyable thing for her to sit while he explained all the things in Mr. Knightley's collection. But she did it, and there's no complaint, there's no martyrdom, there's no reluctance. She just does it, and she's been doing it all her life.
Yes. And then, of course, there's the other side. You know, this time what came through really was just this joyous person that, in spite of her constrained life, she is so happy in herself. She thinks she's smart. She's got all these views about the world, which she's got no real evidence for them. And I find that charming in a way, the way she has this confidence in herself that she knows the way the world is. She hasn't been about much, but she knows what it's all like, and she can interpret it all.
Mm. And another thing that, again, I didn't really get until this close read is the relationship with Knightley. It is so much more two-way than I'd remembered when I thought back on the book. And the number of times when, in fact, he's wrong and she's right actually surprised me when I went through. You talked about them keeping score, and often when she's mentally keeping score, she does reflect that actually he's right, but there are plenty of times when she was right.
Such as?
Well, for example, when he says men of sense don't want silly, pretty wives.
Oh, yes.
His brother married a silly, pretty wife. And Emma says, well, no, that's not true. And not just the times when she is actually right, but also the number of times when she is the one to stop the argument getting out of control.
Yes.
She doesn't actually ever really want to fight with him. Now, admittedly, that's partly because she wants him to acknowledge that she's right.
Yes.
But when it seems like it's all getting a bit too serious and complicated, she will tone it down. That first time they were talking about Frank Churchill and they're arguing about him, and Emma says, we are both prejudiced, I for him and you against him. And Knightley says, oh, no, I'm not prejudiced at all. And, of course, He totally is prejudiced.
Yeah.
And Emma knows that. And she admits to her own prejudice. So I think she does actually have the moral high ground in that particular conversation. And when they had the big fight over Harriet and Mr. Martin, she is the one who makes the decision, we need to stop fighting. Yeah, again, it's a little bit calculated, making sure that he sees her when she's nursing baby Emma. But nonetheless, there are times when she is actually more of the adult in the room than he is.
One of the things that's always haunted me from having read the Talking About Jane Austen people so early was they go on about is Emma a snob? I mean, those passages, the one about blood. Actually, I did a word check and found that blood comes up in 3 contexts. Blood meaning inheritance, meaning that sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's actually first mentioned, I think, by Mr. Weston. When he's going through Mrs. Churchill, Mrs. Churchill had no blood. Mrs. Churchill had no inheritance.
Yeah.
The next one is when Miss Hawkins arrives.
Yeah.
And Miss Hawkins has no blood. And then you finally get that long passage where she is going on about how Isabel, by marrying one of the Knightleys, had not brought any shame or anything on the family.
Yeah.
The family had made this really good marriage.
I guess it kind of depends on what you mean by the word snob, because to modernise, that strong belief in blood and the social structure is snobbery. But I kind of keep coming back to, I think I said it last time when we were talking about Mr. Knightley. It was in the commentary for one of the film or TV productions, I can't remember which, that says that Mr. Knightley believes just as much in the social order as Emma does, but he has more compassion. And I think that is the thing. She does have this strong belief in the strata of society, and she's very resistant to the idea of people moving up into her strata from somewhere below. And I guess maybe that's just because, unlike Mr. Knightley, if someone is not from her social strata, she doesn't really talk to them in the same way, whereas he talks to them, even though he does have a strong belief in the social structure, which is why he doesn't actually think it's appropriate for Harriet to marry up too high. But he just has this compassion with it that I think maybe by the end of the book Emma has started to get. So I think, objectively speaking, in the way we use the words today, yes, she is a snob, and that is a little bit hard to take. But I think if you dig beneath the surface, all of the characters in Jane Austen, they all believe in the social distinction between aristocracy, gentry, working people.
Yes. Well, one of the other things with Emma is that she's had very little contact. One feels that perhaps even at the ball at the Crown, she met a wider range of people than she does normally.
That's one of the sad things for Emma. And again, something I'd never really consciously thought about before this close read. She is the most comfortably off of all the Jane Austen heroines.
The most financially secure.
Yeah, as she said, she has no need to get married.
Yes.
Anne Elliot has no need to get married, but that's only because if things get too bad at home, she can go and live with Lady Russell.
Yes.
All of the others need to get married for financial security.
Yes.
Emma absolutely doesn't. And yet, of all of them, Emma has lived the most constrained life. She has travelled the least. She has never been to Box Hill. It's only a few miles away. It's 2 years since she's been to Donwell Abbey.
Which is in walking distance.
Which is in walking distance, at least by a fit young man.
Yes.
She has the most constrained life. So it's really not altogether surprising that some of her views are maybe a bit skew.
Well, romantic, really.
Yeah. She's had to make up the world because she can't be out there and seeing it.
Yes. And again, she tends to think she knows.
Yeah.
For the historical piece for this episode, we decided we really ought to talk about watering places.
Even though the term watering places isn't used in the chapters we talked about today, it is used 3 times in Emma, as well as twice in other Jane Austen books.
The central passage in Emma that relates to watering places is this one. It's quite early on where Mr. Knightley and Emma are first discussing Frank Churchill. and the reason he hasn't visited his father. He cannot want money. He cannot want leisure. We know, on the contrary, that he has so much of both that he is glad to get rid of them at the idlest haunts in the kingdom. We hear of him forever at some watering place or other. A little while ago he was at Weymouth. This proves that he can leave the Churchills.
The question is, what actually is a watering place? So I think the first place I ever heard the term watering places was in Dorothy L. Sayers. It's referring to the town in Have His Carcass. At some point in a later book, Lord Peter refers to it as the reason they were behaving badly was it was the watering place atmosphere. I guess I kind of gleaned from that it's something that Lord Peter looks down on a bit, but I didn't really understand why, and I certainly didn't know what exactly was meant by a watering place.
There are actually 3 dictionary definitions of watering places. It's a place where water may be obtained, especially one where animals and especially livestock come to drink. It is a health or recreational resort featuring mineral springs or bathing, and it is a place such as a nightclub, bar or lounge where drink is available.
Well, it's fairly clear from context in Emma, in the 3 times it's used in Emma, and also in Pride and Prejudice, it's used in connection with Lydia's visit to Brighton, and in Sanditon, it's used as a category for Sanditon. So it's fairly clear from those that in Jane Austen's usage, it is referring to the middle of those definitions,
yes.
The spa or seaside.
Yes. What follows is, I'm afraid, a very scrappy account of this topic, based on lots of bits and pieces I've picked up over the years, combined with some not very efficient Googling. The picture I have is that all over Europe there were underground hot springs sending up water heavily impregnated with chemicals, which could be drunk after the impurities were allowed to settle, and which created mud pools in which people and animals could wallow. Some of these places had been known for their curative properties since Roman times. Others were only beginning to be exploited in the 1600s and 1700s, when some doctors came to agree with local folk medicine that they were helpful for digestive complaints and for rheumatic pain and skin diseases like leprosy if you bathed in them. In 1816, in Epsom in Surrey, for example, a farmer named Henry Wicker noticed that his cows, even in the most sort of dry weather, would not drink out of a water spring on his property. But on the other hand, in boggy weather, they loved chomping around in the mud pools that were created around it. And out of that came the resort of Epsom and Epsom salts, which were sold all over the world for a long time.
And still are, and are recommended for if you've got tired or sore muscles to soak in an Epsom salts bath.
Anyway, these towns all over Europe during this period were becoming spa towns, and local councils and property developers began trying to lure rich sick people in to try the cures. For example, there was Baden-Baden in Germany, there was Vichy in France, there was Montecatini in Italy, and, of course, Bath in England. Furthermore, the developers soon discovered that it paid to offer activities to engage the invalid's spare time and to make life enjoyable for any relations who came with them. In 1704, for example, the city of Bath appointed the well-known dandy Beau Nash to organise public entertainments, dances and concerts, and encouraged the building of more and more elegant assembly rooms to house them. By Jane Austen's time, Bath had ceased to be primarily a town for invalids, but had become a holiday resort and a retirement place for country squires and clergy, army and navy officers, and people who wanted to be considered as belonging to this class. Other towns followed Bath's example, and by the time Emma was written, other towns with hot springs were offering other attractions. Epsom, for example, and Cheltenham had racecourses, and the derby, which was held at Epsom, became almost as well known as the actual Epsom salts. Then, when in the mid-1700s, medical opinion began to focus on cold salt baths as having curative powers, entrepreneurs already had their blueprint of how it should be exploited. Credit is sometimes given to the town of Scarborough in Yorkshire as where this started to happen, because it was on the coast, but it also had its own hot springs, so it was very easy for the doctors to start offering sea bathing in Scarborough as well. So by the end of the century, that is of the 1700s, any fishing village with a long sandy beach seemed ripe for exploitation as a sea bathing place. In Emma, we see Mr. Woodhouse and Isabella discussing the relative merits of Southend in the Thames estuary and Cromer on the Norfolk coast. And, of course, Jane Austen was later to look at the problems facing these developers in Sanditon.
And, of course, in Pride and Prejudice, when Mrs. Bennet wants the whole family to go to Brighton with Lydia, she says a little sea bathing would set me up forever.
Oh, that's right, yes. But at the time Emma was written, sea bathing was not just a matter of running down to the beach and into the water. It became customary to make use of hired bathing machines. These covered horse-drawn wooden booths on wheels. There are lots of wonderful pictures if you Google sea bathing. Served two purposes. They took the bathers far enough out to sea to reach water deep enough for swimming in, and they preserved public modesty by offering a mobile changing hut where the bathers could take off their outer clothes.
So does this mean that by the time of Emma, watering places was used to refer both to the spa towns and to the seaside towns?
I think so. The dictionary definition says it relates to both of them, so I imagine it did. Mm-hmm. That was just a general place where you went for a holiday. We'd call it a resort town now. And resort towns were usually near the beach, but there were other ones.
And it was the kind of holiday where you'd meet lots of other people.
Yes. But to come to Weymouth itself as a watering place, we didn't really need to do much researching, because Zan and Diane, in their wonderful podcast, The Thing About Austin, have gone to such wonderful detail.
So yes, for a lot of detailed information about Weymouth specifically, I will put a link in our show notes to episode 45 of The Thing About Austin.
On the other hand, from listening to it, we can give a sort of a picture about what life was like in Weymouth. They tell us that if you wanted to do any sea bathing, it would have had to be first thing in the morning, because the bathing machines were only available from 6 o'clock in the morning till midday. But after that, there was still plenty of things to do. They say there was a really good library and a beautiful building that you could go to. Something that developed in all these bathing places was there was an esplanade. It took you between the most spectacular houses, which were on the waterfront, and you could walk along and watch the rich people going in and out, or you could look out to sea and see the sea. And then at intervals along them, they would have steps going down to the beach, so you could then walk on the beach and paddle if you wanted to. Mm-hmm. But then they mention a very interesting thing about Weymouth that is relevant to Emma, and that is that Weymouth was a harbour, and so, while it had a lot of big shipping, it also had a lot of pleasure on the water. It was perfectly possible in the afternoon to go out on a sailing boat, because there were little islands scattered around the bay, and you could take little trips, sometimes an hour and a half, sometimes by sail, sometimes by rowing. And, of course, we know about one of them.
Yeah.
Quite early on, the first time almost we hear about the Dixons. We hear about them from Miss Bates. And she says, ever since the service he, that is Mr. Dixon, rendered Jane at Weymouth, when they were out in that party on the water, and she, by the sudden whirling round of something, which one assumes, if you've been reading Swallows and Amazons, is the boom of the sail. by the sudden whirling round of something or other among the sails, would have been dashed into the sea at once, and actually was all but gone if he had not, with the greatest presence of mind, caught hold of her habit. I can never think of it without trembling. But ever since we had the history of that day, I have been so fond of Mr. Dixon. And then there's one other place, and this is something that I hadn't been quite so clear about, but that the thing about Austen people stress is that Franks makes some other references to Weymouth, because another thing you could do for entertainment in Weymouth was go to dances in the assembly halls, because at one point Frank says, "Oh, we danced to that tune at Weymouth, didn't we?" Mm. And in a sense, I think that is the knowledge of watering places you need to have, or you can work out for yourself after you've read Emma.
For the pop culture section this week, now that I've finished all of the screen and web series adaptations I could get hold of, since I couldn't get hold of Aisha, I thought before I start talking about book adaptations in our last 2 episodes, I'd use this one to just reflect back on all the screen adaptations now that I've seen them and got a bit of distance from them, and just think about things that I particularly liked in each of them, because this is something I've found with Jane Austen adaptations. Even in the ones I don't like, and certainly there have been some adaptations, not just of Emma, that I really don't like.
Yes.
But I've always found something in them that I like or that's thought-provoking. So what I want to talk about is just the things that have stuck with me months after watching them.
Right.
So first of all, the 1972 BBC series, the one with Doreen Godwin as Emma and John Carson as Mr. Knightley. 2 things that have really stuck with me in that. One of them is at Donwell Abbey, the scene when Jane comes in and tells Emma that she is exhausted, and the Jane actress delivered that so well. I felt it was really powerful. And the other one that really stuck with me, and it's not actually in the book, it's when Emma and Mr. Knightley are out in the garden and he's proposed to her. When it gets to the point where in the book you don't hear Emma's response because Jane Austen tells us what did she say, she said what she ought. They avoided the issue of giving Emma lines. By from there, they cut to Mr. Woodhouse back in the house, absolutely beside himself with worry because Emma hasn't come in. And I felt it was so believable of Mr. Woodhouse. And that Mr. Woodhouse actor was also a little bit frail looking. And I just loved that moment of he's almost frantic with worry for Emma because she's been out in the garden for too long. I loved that moment. Then the 1996 Miramax film, the Gwyneth Paltrow as Emma and Jeremy Northam as Mr. Knightley. I didn't like that all that much at the time. I watched it again for this. It still didn't do a lot for me, but again, 2 moments that I liked. The scene, which annoyed me the first time I saw it, of Emma and Mr. Knightley doing archery and having a conversation at the same time. It was very funny and it did capture the banter between them. So I did like that. But the other one that I particularly liked is in The Ball at the Crown when Harriet isn't dancing and it keeps cutting to Emma and you can see that she's dancing and she's looking over her shoulder trying to see has anyone asked Harriet to dance? Is she dancing? What's happening? And she can't enjoy it herself because she's so busy worried about Harriet, and I thought that worked really well.
Yes.
The other one in 1996, the ITV TV series with Kate Beckinsale as Emma and Mark Strong as Mr. Knightley. My memory from back in 1996 was that I enjoyed that more than the Gwyneth Paltrow one. But having said that, on rewatching it, it was fine. And I did think of all the adaptations, it gave the most credit to the Frank and Jane plot, which most of the others dismissed a bit. But the moment that really sticks with me from that one is the added scene at the end, which is, I think it's meant to be a kind of harvest dinner. And you have Mr. Knightley giving a speech about stability in the future. And again, not in the book, but kind of to me did echo this thing of Emma is sort of about stability, about the English way of life. Yeah, what you were saying about keeping the peace in the village, everyone's still talking to each other. So that did kind of fit thematically, I thought. The next one was the 2009 BBC series with Romola Garai as Emma and Johnny Lee Miller as Mr. Knightley. That was the one that I'd had the DVD for years and I'd never watched. Yeah, I wasn't that interested in seeing another Emma, and I'd heard bad things about it. But when I watched it, I really enjoyed it. I really did. And the two things that stood out for me in this, one of them was, and I definitely talked about it when we did the episode, there's a scene where Miss Bates is calling out of the window to Emma and Harriet, and they won't come up. And then Miss Bates turns back, and it's just a small room and her mother who's deaf and Miss Bates and a letter from Jane. And it is so sad.
Yes.
I had never really thought before just how sad Miss Bates's life is. And the friend I was watching with at the time, she had exactly the same reaction. I thought that was such a powerful moment. But the other thing in this one, and it's possibly the moment I treasure most from all of the Emmas, and it's not in the book, this one made a bit of a thing about the fact that one line in the book where Emma says, "I've never been to the seaside." This came up several times in this series, and the conclusion of it is she's married Mr. Knightley and they're going off on their honeymoon and he hasn't told them where they're going, and they arrive and they're at the seaside. And honestly, it was so beautiful, it almost made me cry. I had actually forgotten when I was watching this that in the book it does say that after their wedding they're going to spend 2 weeks at the seaside. But I just thought it was the perfect culmination of that series.
Yes.
And then, of course, the most recent direct adaptation is the 2020 film. And again, two moments I particularly liked. One was in the Box Hill scene when Mr. Knightley is telling Emma off. In a lot of the other adaptations, he starts out really angry with her. In this one, he starts out just so disappointed. He builds up to anger in the end, but at the beginning it's almost he cannot believe Emma has done this. He is so disappointed in her, and I thought that worked really well. And the other moment I really loved in this one was the scene when Harriet comes to tell Emma that her father is a tradesman, and she knows Emma's views on the social structure, and she's just standing there and she's got her chin raised and she's almost defiantly saying, "This is who my father is." And then Emma says, "When he comes, I hope you will bring him to call at Hartfield." Oh, and I thought that was a beautiful moment too.
Yes.
Because one thing that film did was it really built up the relationship between Harriet and Emma, which was very nice.
Mm.
So those are some moments that stand out to me. And in terms of the characters themselves, up until I watched the 2009 version, I had always felt none of the film adaptations made me get Emma. None of them made me understand why I should like Emma as a character. So if I had to pick my favourite Emma, it would have been Alicia Silverstone in Clueless. Because what she brought was what you were actually talking about a bit earlier, I think. She brought a joy of life to Emma. She really was someone you could engage with, which I didn't feel any of the others did. And my mental recollection of most of those others, and this isn't how they necessarily were for the whole thing, but when I think back on them, almost invariably, I think of someone who is still and statuesque and looking a bit disapproving.
Right.
But then I watched the 2009 version, and Romola Garai is not like that at all. She has a very expressive face, and she does bring a lot more joy and laughter to Emma and in her relationship with Knightley. So if I'm excluding Alicia Silverstone, I would definitely say that she is my favourite Emma. And I'm not, of course, trying to say any of these are the best Emma. It's just my personal perception.
Yes.
The Harriet Smiths, the only one I didn't like, and I really hate having to say this, but I hated Toni Collette's Harriet Smith in the 1996 one opposite Gwyneth Paltrow, because she was bigger, she was clumsy, she was awkward, but that to me is not Harriet Smith. I just didn't like it, whereas I particularly liked the 1972 BBC Harriet, who was not necessarily stupid, but incredibly suggestible. But to a greater or lesser degree, I liked most of the others except Toni Collette, which is nothing against Toni Collette because I think she's wonderful in other things I've seen her in, just not that. Mr. Knightley, I liked Jeremy Northam in the 1996 with Gwyneth Paltrow, and I really liked Johnny Lee Miller in the 2009, and I think what set those two apart, and also the Knightley equivalent in Clueless and the Knightley equivalent in the web series Emma Approved, what worked for all of them is the relationship with Emma. There was more banter with Emma. You could see that they'd just known each other forever and they liked each other even when they were fighting.
Yes.
So it's kind of hard for me to choose between all of those. If I had to pick one, I'd almost say Johnny Lee Miller, though.
Yes.
The last two I want to talk about are Mr. Woodhouse and Miss Bates. I find I don't really have a lot to say about different Mr. Eltons and Mrs. Eltons and different Jane Fairfaxes.
Yes.
But with Mr. Woodhouse, I liked the 1972, the level of frailty he was given. He was played by Donald Eccles, who they said was specifically chosen partly because he did bring a level of fragility.
Yes.
The 2009 had Michael Gambon, and I really liked that. What they did with that was they chose an aspect of Mr. Woodhouse which was not necessarily any sort of cognitive limitations, but just the level of neediness, and they tied that to the death of his wife and therefore wanting to be overprotective of his daughters. And while Michael Gambon's physicality doesn't necessarily match to the fragility I saw in the 1972 version, I did feel that the emotional backstory they gave him resonated with the book without necessarily being exactly Mr. Woodhouse as I see him in the book. By contrast, in the 2020 version, where they had Bill Nighy as Mr. Woodhouse, he was really funny. Laughed and laughed at him, but this misses, to me, all of the essence of Mr. Woodhouse of the book. While I enjoyed it, I wouldn't say it in any way for me captured the character of the book. The last one to talk about is Miss Bates, and all of them have been good in different ways.
Is that perhaps because they've been given such very good lines?
Well, I think partly it's they've been given such very good actresses. In 1972, Miss Bates was played by Constance Chapman, who was quite respected, but more significantly, in both of the 1996 productions, she was played by extraordinarily good comic actresses. So in the Miramax production, she was played by Sophie Thompson, and in the ITV version, she was played by Prunella Scales. They played different variants of a purely comic character. All of them, I should say, also at the Box Hill scene, you could see that she was hurt. With these two, you'd had the comedy, but then you got the hurt.
Yeah.
The 2009 one, which is the one, as I said, where you really saw her loneliness, she was played not so much by a comic actress as by a wonderful character actress, Tamsin Greig, and brought so much depth to the character. And then lastly, in 2020, she was played by Miranda Hart, who again brought a lot to the character. So I honestly couldn't say which of them is my favourite, but I would say that in 2009, Tamsin Greig's presentation of loneliness really hit me in a way none of the others did.
Yeah.
But she was perhaps a little less funny than some of the others. So again, it depends on what you're trying to do. So those were just some fairly random just reflections on the productions and what I took away from them. I liked some more than others. Until we did this podcast, the only one I had watched multiple times was Clueless. The other ones I'd seen once each and never gone back to, except for 2009, which I hadn't seen at all. Post doing the podcast, I will probably watch Clueless again, and I will probably also watch the 2009 version again. I'm not sure I'll revisit any of the others. You've been listening to the Reading Jane Austen podcast with me, Harriet.
And me, Ellen. In our next episode, we'll be looking at chapters 46 to 50 of Emma.
The structure of this podcast was inspired by Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Our music is Creative Commons performances of pieces Jane Austen might have listened to.
You can find us on our website, readingjaneausten.com. We're also on Facebook at Reading Jane Austen and Instagram at reading_Jane_Austen.
You can email us at readingjaneausten.com or rate and review us in your podcast app. We hope you'll join us next time.